All right, let's talk about something that's at the very heart of American politics. It's one of those beliefs that's so powerful, so persistent, that we almost never stop to question it. We're going to dig into who really spends your money, who grows the government, and who shrinks it. And trust me, the data might just flip what you think you know.
So here it is, the big one. This is the central idea we're going to put to the test today. For decades, the story we've all been told is pretty simple, right? Republicans are the party of small government, and Democrats are the party of big government. But is that actually true? Well, let's forget the rhetoric and just follow the numbers.
First up, we're going to look at what we can call the government's footprint. And right away, the data shows a pattern that is, well, it's pretty surprising.
Now, to do this right, we can't just look at the total dollars spent. That doesn't really work, because the economy is always getting bigger. Instead, we're going to use a much better metric: federal spending as a share of the entire economy, or GDP. You can think of it as the government's economic footprint. It's really the clearest way to see if the government is truly growing or shrinking compared to the country as a whole.
Okay, so take a look at this. When we chart this footprint over time, man, a really fascinating pattern just pops out. Notice those downward trends, the parts highlighted in yellow? Those happened during the Clinton and Obama administrations. In both cases, the government's share of the economy actually shrank. Now contrast that with the Republican presidents. The trend is either flat or, as you see with those red lines, it's actually rising. This is our first huge clue that the conventional wisdom might be completely backwards.
That historical pattern is pretty eye-opening, right? So let's zoom in a bit. Let's take a much closer look at the Republican record president by president.
But hold on, before we do, there's a really important point to make here. To be totally fair in this analysis, we have to account for major national crises. I'm talking about things like the 2008 financial collapse or the COVID pandemic. Those things required absolutely massive short-term government spending. So what we've done is separate that crisis spending out of the equation. That way, we can see what happened to the underlying base level of government under each president.
And wow, the results are pretty striking. See these red bars? They show the change in that base spending for each Republican president since Reagan. And here's the crucial point. Not a single one of them is negative. Reagan, Bush Sr., Bush Jr., and Trump, they all left the government's economic footprint either the exact same size or even larger than when they came into office. The party that brands itself on small government simply hasn't delivered it. The Trump administration is a perfect case study of how this plays out. Remember those huge 2017 tax cuts? They were passed with the promise that deep spending cuts would follow to pay for them. But those cuts never happened. A staggering 80% of the promised cuts were scheduled for after his term was over. And the rest? They were just abandoned. So the tax cuts were very, very real. But the spending cuts that were supposed to balance them out, they were a total mirage.
So you gotta ask, right? If you're cutting taxes but you're not cutting spending, where does all that money come from? Well, that brings us to the national deficit. And on this issue, we find a problem that is absolutely bipartisan.
The answer, of course, is borrowing. The government just borrows the money, and that creates a budget deficit. So how does that track record look?
And when it comes to deficits, the record is it's one of bipartisan failure. As you can see here, with the red bars for Republicans and the blue ones for Democrats, every single president of the 21st century, Bush Jr., Obama, Trump, and Biden, has run up significant deficits. When it comes to actually living within the government's means, neither party has a clean record, not even close. So at the end of the day, this is the core paradox we've just uncovered. On one hand, you have the political brand. You hear all the buzzwords: small government, fiscal conservatism, restraint. But on the other hand, you have the cold, hard data, which paints a very different picture. Government's footprint staying flat or getting bigger, deficits getting wider, and big tax cuts being paid for not by spending cuts, but by more and more borrowing. All right, let's put all of these pieces together. Let's finally break down and explain what's really going on with the great fiscal myth. What the data shows is this really predictable four-step fiscal pattern that's become a playbook. Step 1, cut taxes, which obviously lowers how much money the government brings in. Step 2, instead of cutting spending, the biggest parts of the budget, things like defense and major entitlements like Social Security and Medicare, are left untouched or even increased. Step 3, you finance that gap between lower revenue and steady spending with debt. And step 4, the inevitable result is a wider national deficit.
And that right there brings us to the ultimate takeaway. The deficits, as we saw, are bipartisan. But the data is clear. Only Democrats have ever actually cut the government's footprint in recent history. The modern Republican Party doesn't shrink the government. It just changes how it's fed. They cut taxes, and then they just borrow the difference. And that right there is the great fiscal myth.